Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. This is episode 61. My name is Matt Wood, and this is part 5 in my series on the California Wine Association, Winehaven. Last time we saw the CWA battle against the Calamity, as the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire were called. Much of San Francisco was destroyed, and the CWA suffered huge losses of wine, over 10 million gallons, plus offices, cooperage, warehouses, and cellars. The amount of wine in their country cellars throughout California, as well as some heroic action from members of the company, would allow them to continue on. But a short 1906 crop would place added pressure on Morgan. Before we start, I'd like to let you know there is a Patreon you can donate to if you'd like to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free. If you don't want to or can't, that's okay too. Maybe you could tell a friend who would have an interest in listening also. Thanks. Here we go. The California Wine Association would decide to not rebuild in San Francisco. The city had its advantages like proximity to large banks and businesses and a cool climate to allow wines to mature slowly. Disadvantages were the amount of offices and redundancies that being spread throughout the city required. Shipping could be difficult also. Ships needed to traverse the shallow waters of the bay, and trains needed to move all the way down the peninsula before connecting to the Transcontinental Railroad. Any new location would need to have some specific features. Bridges weren't crossing the bay yet, so an isolated peninsula like San Francisco wasn't ideal. The location would need to be on the water with access to deep water shipping. Although long delayed, the Panama Canal was being built, and that would shave precious time off of any shipment going to Europe or the eastern U.S. and, of course, New Orleans. Ideally, it would be across the bay for easy access to the Transcontinental Railroad terminus in either Oakland or Point Richmond. This would further improve delivery times and access, doing away with the indirect routes of trains going all the way to San Jose from San Francisco before hooking up with the Transcontinental Railroad. They also appreciated the insulating aspects of the bay, the cool Pacific Ocean air that blew in and kept the wine at a comfortable temperature year-round. After searching, they found a 47-acre plot of land across the bay in Richmond at Point Melody. You can just about see it from San Francisco. Melody wasn't always called that. Its original name is lost to time. The island, now called Red Rock in the bay, was named Molete during the Mexican period because of its conical shape. In 1826, it was misspelled on documents, as so often happened in early California, replacing the first E with an A, and the misspelling was used in the first official surveys of the area in 1851. It stuck. The native Hashan band of Ohlone had lived in this territory for around 5,000 years. Elk, deer, antelope, grizzlies, and mountain lions roamed the land. Canvasback ducks and sandpipers fed in the bay. Rainbow trout and their ocean-going version, the steelhead, shrimp, mussels, and clams were abundant in the waters. Their diet was varied and also included nuts, greens, sea lions, rabbits, and more. Shell mounds were present here too. These were mounds of shells, but also earth, acorns, human, and animal bones. There were ceremonial sites and burial grounds, meeting places, and a high ground to light fires used to send signals. The people were skilled with weaving baskets, boats, and huts from the tules covering the shoreline. Most likely, they first encountered the Spanish in 1772 with the Fallas and De Anza expeditions. The Spanish were received well by 2 villages alongside Wildcat Creek containing a couple hundred people. Within a generation, most were forcibly moved to Mission Dolores in San Francisco. Some were also scattered amongst the other missions. A village was established here by the mission for the neophyte men to hunt, fish, and gather to supplement the food supply, and the neophyte women to turn wool into cloth. Eventually, the area was abandoned as the missions were secularized. When the land was purchased by the CWA, there was a Chinese shrimping community living at the point, with over 100 boats, 30 huts, and 5 wharves. Some of their catch would be sold locally, but most of it was dried and shipped to China. The point and surrounding area had been and would continue to be a popular spot for a variety of industries. Some before, some after, including brickmaking, a quarry, can manufacturing, yacht harbor, ferry terminal, sardine and other fish processing, the Standard Oil Company, and a Del Monte-owned whale processing plant, the last active one in the United States. The Pullman Railcar Company erected a plant in Richmond just a couple years after Winehaven was built. As we mentioned earlier, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific Railroads terminated nearby. The small but upcoming Richmond had 54 saloons at the time, and it was earning its nickname, Pittsburgh of the West. They had chosen a place, and now they needed to choose a name. After much deliberation, they landed on Winehaven. It was called musical and easy to remember. They were on their way to making the San Francisco Bay the Bordeaux of the Pacific, according to a magazine. Hemingway and Miller would design Winehaven. They were the architects of the Italian-Swiss colony building that withstood the fire so well. They had also done work for C. Schilling. There's a real clear design consistency between the Winehaven buildings and the Italian-Swiss colony building with the bricks and columns and parapets. Construction proceeded swiftly. They wanted it at least decent for the 1907 harvest. The cellar was built originally to hold 6 million gallons of wine, but could be easily expanded to hold 10 million gallons, or even more as it turns out. Louis Wetmore, who we heard about last episode, arranged the purchase of the steamer ship, the City of Stockton. It would serve as a floating boarding house for the men building Winehaven. Others chose to build their own small shacks nearby. As Winehaven was being built, representatives from Livermore and Contra Costa County were visiting the site to admire the size and location. More than one declared that because of this new winery, there would never be an issue with overproduction of grapes. It was also said that in many locations where hay was growing now, the property owners were turning the land into vineyards. Although construction happened as quickly as possible, at times it would have delays in receiving building materials on the overcrowded rail lines. Joaquin Miller, the famed and infamous poet of the Sierras, also visited during construction. His wife and daughter and a bag of eucalyptus tree seeds came along with him. Some of those trees are said to still stand. Joaquin Miller loved planting eucalyptus. He was a promoter of California wines in the most Joaquin Miller way possible. Quote, "Oakland people should learn two things: to drink their native wines instead of water, and to build good sewers. Then we will have a bustling city," unquote. The grounds had a frontage of 2,000 feet along the bay. Plans called for the winery building to be about 600 feet long by 150 feet, with 2 stories plus a basement. From the outside, it would appear castle-like. The brick was reinforced by 3-foot-thick concrete walls with steel beams inlaid. Another cellar building would be 800 feet by 185 feet with the same design features. Basements of these buildings were made with reinforced concrete and had provisions for another basement wine salvage operation in the off chance it was needed. The main buildings were all Class A fireproof structures. Most of the bricks were made on site with dirt from the extensive grading required to flatten out the land. A sherry house, complete with ovens, and another building for the laboratory would be 80 by 100 feet each. There would, of course, be a cooperage, not just for repairing barrels, but also for making the wooden cases to ship their wines. A byproduct factory would deal with the pressed pomace. This was a pet project of Percy Morgan's. It was equipped with the latest technology to get every penny of value from the stems, seeds, skins, and fibers of the grapes. Oil, cattle feed, tartaric acid, cream of tartar, and more could be extracted from the otherwise wasted pomace. It would be washed a couple times before arriving here and turned into piquette to distill into brandy. Of course, a distillery was on site too. Nothing was wasted here. Custom crushers, presses, destemmers, and conveying systems and more were supplied by Toulouse and De La Rue. 350 horsepower Stirling boilers and Westinghouse generators and engines would supply electricity for the complex. Winehaven, as well as Watoki, Greystone, and the Geyserville winery were all equipped with Siemens machinery wine pumps, some stationary and some portable with silent chain drive mechanisms. Winehaven alone had 16 of these pumps. A forest of tanks and casks would eventually fill the main building. 16 miles worth of walkways between them and 8 miles of elevated gangways. A saltwater-based cooling system would help keep the fermentation temperatures from getting out of hand. They, of course, had filtering and pasteurizing stations as well. Filtering before bottling was common in the CWA. Occasionally, a wine would be pasteurized instead. The Winehaven grounds were truly becoming a company town. 120 were employed year-round, most living on-site. This would soon balloon up to 400 during the harvest season. There was a hotel for those who were visiting or single. It could hold about 100. And cottages for the men who were married. A school, post office, social hall, fire station, of course, and even a baseball team. All in all, Winehaven would total about 35 buildings when finished. The cost to build all of this was over $500,000 in 1906 money. It's about $18 million today. The crowning touch to all this was the large CWA sign sitting on top of the main building, visible from San Francisco. August 25th, 1907 was the first day of crushing at Winehaven. A dedication was held about a week later on September 2nd, 1907, with a who's who of wine, finance, and politics in attendance. The 1907 harvest was going to be about 25,000 tons to make around 4 million gallons of wine, but not all of this could be handled at the new facility yet. Much of it would be diverted to the other still standing wineries. The next year, 1908, Winehaven would handle 4,500 tons of grapes for a yield of about 675,000 gallons, or 13,500 barrels worth of wine. Its annual capacity would eventually be around 25,000 tons of grapes. Shipping to and from Winehaven would be equally easy. A wharf ran 1,800 feet out into the bay waters to allow for deep water shipping. A special small-gauge electric railroad track ran onto the wharf to easily carry the finished bottles of wine to be sent around the world. When bulk shipping was needed, ships would sometimes leave Winehaven loaded with 5,000 barrels of wine. Around 40 ships a year would be sent from here to New York. The Richmond Belt Railway connected them to the Transcontinental Railroad and ran right up to Winehaven. Spur tracks had been built for the nearby Enterprise Brewery also a couple years before. These allowed wines to be sent quickly and easily by rail. Up to 500,000 gallons a month could be shipped this way. These tracks would come in handy on the front end too. Grapes were often crushed at the country wineries and shipped to Winehaven for fermenting. Sometimes whole fruit was sent depending on capacity. And Napa grapes could be sent down the Napa River on boats or by rail, depending on capacity and weather. That small-gauge rail line would have over 8 miles of track laid connecting buildings and facilities to one another. Special freight trains were added by the rail companies during the harvest season to alleviate crowding. 4 railroad cars worth of grapes could unload at once to an endless chain carrier transporting them to the giant 50-ton crusher, capable of processing up to 1.5 tons in 1 minute. Galvanized steel pipes running from the crusher and press could be easily switched to transport must to different fermenters or storage tanks as needed. Despite all the pumps we mentioned earlier, the winery was operated as much by gravity as was practical. One device stands out as seeming like A.R. Morrow's pride and joy. A special blending pump was able to pull wine from up to 10 tanks at once. The flow of each adjustable to enable Morrow and his team to easily blend the massive quantities required. He would mostly work out of his office in San Francisco, the hundreds of samples of wine from all the controlled cellars available to him in the lab. Once a blend was perfected, he would travel across the bay to Winehaven to finalize it. Much like the large production wines of today, keeping a blend consistent was of the highest order. The Oscar Krenz Company installed over 6,000 feet of tinned brass pipe to connect wine tanks, pumps, ice houses, filters, as well as tin-lined tanks of 2,500 gallons each for the CWA grape juice production and make this all possible. One of the largest problems at the time for the CWA was where to put all this wine. Cellars worth of oak barrels and tanks were destroyed in the fire, leaving just piles of hoops and ash. Only one cooperage remained in San Francisco, and tens of thousands of barrels and tanks needed to be replaced. French oak was still a long ways away in the future, and the price of Missouri and Arkansas oak almost doubled overnight. The Los Angeles coopers were as busy as they had ever been, and in addition to wine casks, they were producing brandy, whiskey, and pickle barrels. The CWA found their solution in redwood. Large redwood tanks that could be coopered from locally grown wood would cost less than half of what oak would go for, 3 cents per gallon versus 7 cents for oak. Redwood had been used before and was proven, if maybe a little outdated. It was still used, though, to store a range of liquids. Water tanks for railroads, oil tanks, beer, and bases for tanning leather or dyeing fabrics. The wood doesn't bend easily like oak, so it was almost exclusively used for large fermenters and storage tanks. There would be exceptions like the straight-sided redwood pipes that were occasionally used. We saw Bugbee using them in episode 40. Similar to Bugbee's prescribed treatment, it was recommended to fill and soak them a couple times with salt water and then fresh water, changing it every 24 hours to leach out the harsh redwood tannins, flavors, and colors from the tanks. The CWA did have an open competition advertised in the papers with an award and a barrel-shaped trophy if anyone could find a wood that could replace oak for cooperage. Hedging their bets, they purchased a barrel maker and their timberland in Arkansas to supply the association's American oak needs. This became the CWA Cooperage Company and came with 17,000 acres of white oak. Visitors were common at Winehaven. The CWA would regularly host local leaders or businessmen, sometimes casually, sometimes these were large events. They loved for the hotel men to visit, gave Morgan and others a chance to stress that California wine should appear on their menus and be served at their banquets. There were always some hesitant to do this, and there still are. B.F. Lamborn of the Allied Grape and Wine Growers accompanied the hotel men on one excursion. From his speech, quote, "Now, gentlemen of the hotels, take this in mind. Remember that we are of you and for you, but get behind our industry. See that your wine lists are reprinted and that your patriotic principles back in it." Unquote. They even took riders and other guests for cruises on the water, stopping sometimes at San Quentin Prison directly across the bay where a band might play a few tunes before they caught the boat back to Winehaven. The CWA continued its expansion with more purchases even while constructing Winehaven, like the 800-acre Eggers Vineyard in Fresno with its attached large winery and the 270,000 gallons of wine they had in storage. The giant Watoki winery was enlarged during this time, the new building surpassing the capacity of all its former winery buildings combined. 113 by 220 feet and built mostly of rock from the surrounding hills. Bricks were still pretty scarce and expensive due to all the post-earthquake rebuilding, and the rock was nearly free. The 2-million-gallon Lackman and Jacoby winery in Petaluma was also rushed to completion in 1907. It was the largest fine wine and brandy plant in the state until Winehaven was finished. An additional 1 million gallons of capacity would be added soon. This was a series of brick buildings with cement foundations, consist of a large main building, the sherry house, cooperage, boiler house, shipping center, and additional storage buildings. It took up nearly the entire block. The main building was 380 by 133 feet alone. Although Lackman and Jacoby started out as a firm that would purchase wines from others, blending and aging them to taste, they had long since run wineries and vineyards to control the process from start to finish. A.R. Morrow pushed growers to plant more white grapes on the gravelly soils of Livermore, working to expand acreage in this premium dry white wine district. For the previous 30 years, the Bordeaux cuttings of white grapes had thrived in Livermore. The annual shareholders' report and meeting was pretty good. It must have been very impressive for the shareholders. It was the first visit to Winehaven for most of them, and they got a chance to see it while the finishing touches were being completed. Stakeholder dividends had started up again, and the CWA was making money despite the San Francisco destruction and the Fresno plant explosion. Morgan, too, was concerned with new vineyards being planted during this stretch, especially ones on the flatter southern San Joaquin Valley. He felt like the wrong varieties were going in. Things more suitable for dry wines were being planted in this sweet wine climate. The CWA put a new product on the market during this time. The CWA Products Company would sell unfermented grape juice in 2 varieties, Zinfandel for red and Muscatel for white. To make it, chilled juice was shipped to Winehaven from a plant in Fresno in hermetically sealed casks. Once the bottles were cold-filled at 32 degrees, they were then slowly heated to 175 degrees and held there for an hour following Pasteur's recommendations. This new product was a way of the CWA looking towards the future. Quote, "It is the pure product of nature, nothing more. No adulterations, no additives. It is the grape minus the seed, skin, and pulp. The finest grapes in California in liquid form." Unquote. They touted its potential medical benefits, refreshing taste, and how much children loved it. Of course, it was alcohol-free, and by now we see prohibition starting to creep in more, especially in the Midwest and the East, putting the CWA on their toes. 1908 shows growers all over organizing protective organizations. Napa, Sacramento, Santa Clara, and Sutter County all organized in the span of a month. It was hoped that this would help stabilize or raise prices for each region. All the growers pulling, or to use Morgan's earlier words, kicking in the same direction. George Beveridge of the CWA had started to announce the conditions of the cellars and what prices might look like for the 1908 harvest. In a couple words, low and light. Quote, "An exceedingly large amount of last year's vintage is still in cooperage, and this condition will naturally tend to force the price down. This also indicates there is no demand for wine to speak of." Unquote. In Lodi, the quality and yield was actually looking decent, better than the previous couple years. But Sonoma, always the powerhouse at this time, was going to be very light. The Lodi Opera House was packed to standing room only on a Saturday night shortly before harvest. Growers representing over 50,000 acres crowded in to hear the situation of the upcoming harvest. W.A. Washington of the San Joaquin Wine Growers Association announced that wines were not selling right now. Cellars were full all over this area and the wider areas as well. They absolved the CWA of any maliciousness in grapes going unsold, but that didn't make it any easier to take. He broke down the reasons for the assembled growers. 1. Prohibition. 10 years ago, it was a small and relatively insignificant section. It was now nearly half the United States. 2. It was said that 400,000 people of Italian descent, responsible for consuming 20 million gallons of wine a year, had left the country in the last 2 years. 3. Overproduction. A lot of new vineyards had come online. Some newly planted by people wanting to get in on the grape action, and also the replanted vineyards on phylloxera-resistant rootstock were starting to produce more while the demand was going down. We saw a couple minutes ago the discussion of ripping up hayfields to plant vineyards. 4. A financial depression that was hitting the entire U.S., affecting not just the wine market, but nearly every other industry as well. A plan was hatched and agreed upon. Get whatever you can for your grapes this year, and hopefully by next year, there will be more competition between local wineries purchasing grapes. For some regions like Fresno, the CWA had withdrawn its grape purchasing offer for the year. It did offer to crush and ferment any grapes delivered and store the wine until May, keeping 1/3 of the product as payment. This offer was later withdrawn after accusations from the Fresno growers accusing the CWA of depressing the price. The situation was similar in Sonoma, where the offer was an extremely low $4 per ton, plus a cut of whatever the wine was sold for once it hit the market. Sonoma, Contra Costa, Alameda, Santa Cruz, and nearly every other wine-producing region finished organizing for their own grower associations. 2/3 of the growing acreage were now represented by these organizations. In addition to what we discussed a few minutes ago, they would also attempt to educate folks on drinking California wines, those pure, native wines, while trying to be sure that temperance would win in the fight against prohibition. As the vintage got closer, Sonoma grapes would hit $10 per ton and Napa $11. Super low still, and on the 3-payment plan we discussed earlier, but much better than $4 per ton. Livermore's yield was way down, only about 60% of normal. In a periodical column, Morgan wrote that 1908, quote, experienced the most unfavorable conditions that have occurred in 10 years, unquote. There was so much overproduction, many cellars were still full of 1907 wine as the 1908 vintage approached. We heard all the reasons during that meeting at the Lodi Opera House, but Morgan added a new foe, Italian wines. Imports of Italian wines had been steadily increasing for 20 years. In 1890, it was only 225,000 gallons. It rose 10 to 20,000 gallons a year until in 1900 it was up to 429,000 gallons. Then some big jumps. 963,000 gallons by 1903, and over 2.5 million gallons in 1908. Morgan soon found himself again in Washington, battling the proposed lowering of tariffs on imported wines. He feared this new wave of Italian wines and the standby French wines flooding the already saturated U.S. market. Of particular concern was that freight rates to New York amounted to 6 cents a gallon, chipping into the already thin margins. California producers in some cases were paying more in tax to import their empty glass bottles to be filled than European producers were paying to import full bottles of wine. The one bright spot Morgan had in that column was that their bottled wines seemed to be on the upswing, and although the vast majority of shipments were still bulk and in barrels, people were beginning to trust the bottled in California wines from companies they thought reputable like CWA. Even so, the California table wine prices had continued to drop to 15 cents a gallon, or quote, bedrock, as William Hansen, the CWA's vice president and general manager, referred to it. Wine sales weren't coming to a complete stop. There were reports of wine jobbers in Kansas City stocking up on all the wines they could afford while prices were low. We have to imagine this was happening in other cities as well. 1909 was slightly better. Dry wine sales improved. It was noted that gallons sold had greatly increased. Perhaps this was from the opportunistic jobbers spread throughout the country. The leadership felt like this whole prohibition movement was losing a bit of steam. More and more big shipments were going to dry towns and states. Illinois, Kansas, and Vermont was a big one. Vermont had found it extremely difficult to keep the skilled Italian workers in the marble quarries when they were denied access to their claret. In order to deal with the oversupply of grapes for the 1909 harvest, with their cellars already very full, the CWA would turn much of the crop, especially in the sweet wine districts, into brandy, throttling back usage of the wineries as much as possible except for the needed fermentations. They were able to receive some quick cash returns for the brandy, although not too much per gallon. Operations were condensed a little bit. They moved to sell off the wineries they found redundant. Almost every county had some. It didn't take too long for the CWA to expand their San Francisco presence again, although in a different way. In 1909, the CWA distribution arm opened an office and sampling room at 2nd and Market. Photos of vineyards and cellars and wineries hung around the room. Artistically rendered bunches of grapes sat on tables. Even the electric lights looked like grapes. Bottles of wine and grape juice showing all the CWA company products filled the shelves. People passing by could be drawn in by the vibrant stained glass windows depicting Winehaven or the giant Watoki vineyard or the barrel room at Greystone. It was another way for them to educate potential customers on their wines. Early reports were that the 1910 harvest was looking great. Frederick Bialetti of the university was impressed by what he saw in a trip to Sonoma and Napa. Rumors swirled that the West wineries in the San Joaquin Valley were going to be offering $10 a ton for grapes for a 10-year period. They let the rumors dangle out there and then denied them finally, stating it was only valid this year and of a particular grade of grapes. However, they were upbeat about the coming prospects, noting that acreage had been pulled up recently and they saw the balance returning to the business. The going rate would be paid by them for grapes or wine that year, whatever it may be. They would end up purchasing a lot, crushing 8,000 tons at their Lodi wineries and another 12,000 tons at the flagship El Pinal winery in Stockton. Towards the end of the season, they estimated there were another 1,500 tons out in the fields they still needed to find a home for also. Tokay's, Zinfandel, and Mission were doing especially well this year. Lackman and Jacoby also received a bulk order from the East for 2,000 barrels of wine late in the season, clearing out valuable cellar space. The surplus of wines did fix itself a little bit, just not in the way most would want. Care of the wine in the country cellars had been hit or miss as sales slumped. Some producers stopped topping barrels or caring about the wines as they hung around for a couple years going unsold. They didn't view the low price they might receive as worth it, and many eventually ended up getting dumped or distilled. With the 1910 European harvest being almost totally wiped out, the CWA was given another boost, expanding and shipping more wine to Europe. Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, and even France were customers. What made this especially sweet in the eyes of the CWA was that the sales were based on samples, meaning the wines were tasted, appreciated, and then purchased, lending them a feeling of finally being recognized. Eastern sales also boomed as European imports dwindled. P.C. Rossi of the Italian Swiss colony was especially excited about the further sales of wine and glass. Quote, "During the past year, we have also noticed a healthy increase in the sale of cased goods, not only at home and in the Northwest, but also throughout the Middle West and in the Atlantic states. This is the result of extensive advertising on our part, the good effects of the protective tariff, and the gradual change of sentiment which is certainly being felt in favor of native wines, since the public have had a chance to taste our best California wines under California labels. In the old days, our best California wines were sent to New York and there bottled in the dark cellars of the metropolis and given the label of some famous foreign brand. Only our poorer California wines were offered under their true label, and naturally they did not make a very favorable impression on our Eastern brethren." Unquote. The Italian Swiss colony would especially benefit from this, shipping 8 carloads at a time on occasion to New York, most of it going on to Europe. This European boost would only last a few years until war made the process impossible. The Italian Vineyard Company near Los Angeles, perhaps the CWA's only true competitor, had a rough season. Heavy northern winds had swept through their sandy vineyard in the spring, damaging the flowering vines. To make matters worse, the winds returned earlier than usual in the fall, further damaging the ripe grapes on their 4,000-acre vineyard, the largest in the U.S. One thing the CWA always had was geographical diversity. They owned vineyards and wineries in almost every viticultural district except for El Dorado, which also encompassed Amador and some other Sierra foothills regions. It was still tough during the CWA's expansion phase to get grapes or wine from those areas. Train tracks are still rare in this hilly terrain, and you can hear more about the complaints in episode 24 on the Jackson Experiment Station. Change is always a constant here, and so it was with the CWA when Percy Morgan announced his retirement for health reasons in 1911. He had been suffering greatly due to stress and exhaustion from the calamity of the earthquake and fire, the building of Winehaven, and the general unease of the wine business. Quote, "The winemen not only of California, but of the United States will read with special interest the announcement that Percy T. Morgan, the well-known San Francisco capitalist and the live wire of the California Wine Association, will retire from his official position on the 23rd of February, at which time the annual meeting will be held and his resignation accepted. Mr. Morgan's retirement is due entirely to failing health, which demands that he shall suspend all business activity and take an indefinite rest. It is Mr. Morgan's intention to depart with his family for Europe, where he will place 2 of his children in school. He will take a year's rest and then return to San Francisco to resume his residence." Unquote. Morgan had seen the CWA rise to a power in the wine industry most likely unequaled before or since. It was not announced at first who would fill his large shoes. On the edge of retirement, Morgan preached peace, fairness, and cooperation. Quote, "What I said 10 years ago, I now desire to repeat as a valedictory. The viticultural industry has had its share of controversy. Let peace now reign, and plenty and prosperity will follow as naturally as water flows downhill. Let the various elements come together, talk together, work together. All want success, but let not the success of one spell disaster for the other. All can be prosperous if all will only cooperate instead of each element regarding the other as his natural enemy or as his natural prey. Therefore, let the maxim henceforth be fairness. Fairness from the grower to the winemaker to the merchant, and the merchant to both the grower and the winemaker." Unquote. At the annual CWA shareholders meetings, Morgan was given round after round of toasts and speeches of appreciation. Rossi, Schilling, Jacoby, Hellman, all these names we've heard many times throughout this episode, praised the man that led their wine firms to solid ground. Even others like Frank Sweat, who it seemed had little in common with Morgan, praised the man for his, quote, "strong, intelligent, and far-seeing management," unquote. A silver set from Shreve & Co. was presented to him. There were rumors printed that Morgan was in fact stepping down because the Italian Swiss colony had purchased a controlling interest in the CWA. But it appears that they were just rumors. P.C. Rossi refuted these rumors and also declined to become the head of the California Wine Association. He was the one most really wanted. Benjamin R. Kitteridge, previously of the George West and Sons Winery, was elected after Morgan retired. Kitteridge had been a powerful man in the CWA, leading the massive George West Winery as its general manager and partner. You'll remember the West Winery produced mostly sweet and fortified wines as well as brandy in the Stockton area, and they were gigantic. He was also a principal in the amusingly named Sonoma Wine and Brandy Company of New York, his home state. It had nothing to do with Sonoma except for the name. Frank West and Kitteridge had also partnered in purchasing the massive 1,000-acre Lucerne vineyard in 1902, planted with the Muscats, Malagas, as well as some pure wine grapes. An additional purchase a couple years later would increase it to 1,500 planted acres. A Harvard graduate, he was also a millionaire already and well known to everyone in the association. It was announced that no policy changes would take place with Kitteridge taking over. Business as usual for now. Winehaven would continue to be improved under his leadership. 1912 saw $500,000 worth of improvements. A new 600-horsepower motor installed by the Western States Electric Company would power the plant. Another building was added just to house the transformer required for it. The fermenting house had an additional story added, and the bottling plant was expanded. Crushing would also be expanded, allowing 10,000 tons a year to be crushed at Winehaven. Because of the railway lines and the bayside docks, the CWA had often found it convenient to have the grapes crushed closer to vineyard and the musts shipped to Winehaven and then fermented. They did make a lot of wine here. About 11 million bottles of wine were in the storage warehouse, waiting to be shipped out when Kitteridge took over. If you remember at the start, their other offices were in New York and Los Angeles. But by now they had Chicago, Cincinnati, Denver, Galveston, Louisville, Memphis, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. offices as well. They also had agencies around the world, including London, Hamburg, Brussels, Stockholm, Yokohama, and Mexico City to distribute those bottles out into their territories. Other wineries in the system would get upgrades too. Lackman Jacobi would get nearly $750,000 worth of glass-lined concrete, and the Italian Swiss Colony installed some specifically for their growing sparkling wine production and their side business of selling cream of tartar. The Italian Swiss Colony would also further expand into Contra Costa County, purchasing 1,100 new acres of vineyards in full bearing, planted with Petit Syrah, Alicante Bouschet, Grand Noir, Riesling, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and more, in addition to the 400,000-gallon Mount Diablo winery they had been leasing. A day of recreation was held at Winehaven in June of 1911, a day, quote, in which business was to be forgotten and the spirit of fun was to prevail, unquote. 700 friends of the association traveled to Winehaven aboard its ships. They had a 10-piece band playing for the occasion. As guests arrived, they were transported by the electric train for a tour of the cellars. Then a luncheon with the finest of the CWA's wines and dancing well into the afternoon. The 100 children present were having their own party and games, everyone receiving prizes, win or lose. The San Francisco Chamber of Commerce had a large meeting there soon after, enjoying the boat cruise, food, and wines. And the poet of the Sierras, Joaquin Miller, visited again in 1912. No note of eucalyptus seeds. Expansion in the other winemaking counties continued under Kitteridge also. Nearly every winery in Lodi by 1912 was under the control of the CWA. Most started independently, but over time the CWA would purchase more and more wine from them until there was no other buyer. George West and Sons, on behalf of the CWA, would continue to purchase most of the wineries in the Central Valley and Lodi area, within a couple years of them popping up. The Woodbridge Vineyard Association and the Roma Winery would be the only ones that escaped its grasp for any length of time. Pietro Rossi of the Italian Swiss Colony passed away soon after Morgan's retirement. In a tragic death, the horse pulling his buggy at Asti was spooked and started kicking wildly. Rossi, trying to soothe the animal, was thrown backwards, hitting his head on a rock, and was knocked unconscious. Andrea Sabarbaro summoned the best doctors he knew, but Rossi died while undergoing surgery. He was the man more than any other that upped the quality and consistency of the Italian Swiss Colony wines. Like with the CWA, the colony had capable replacements ready to step in. Mr. Federspiel as general manager and Mark Fontana as president. 1911 also showed the CWA in a spat with a group of so-called independents based in Fresno. That was the sweet wine district, and dollar amounts paid for grapes were much lower than the dry wine counties. At times, the association would purchase raisin grapes that weren't otherwise claimed to make brandy even. Some thought it could be the start of a new wine war, but it soon fizzled out. The independents held meetings to set their own prices for their grapes, but ultimately decided they could still not compete against the CWA, and what was called peace, if not harmony, was agreed upon. Grape prices looked like they would be up a bit this year. Perhaps $10 a ton from the West wineries for sweet wine and brandy production, $2 more than the previous year. Sonoma, Napa, and Santa Clara expected to get twice that, and nearly did, topping out at $18 a ton. CWA continued to expand their area of influence with a large Manteca vineyard coming online that would yield over 5,000 tons. Winery explosions or fires were commonplace, and it's been a while since we've had one in our story. We have two in Fresno in quick succession. The Eisen Winery, we've heard about it a couple times. It was historic even in those days, the oldest in Fresno having been erected in 1870 by pioneer grower Francis Eisen. A Chinese employee was racking sherry when the fumes ignited from his headlamp. Fire soon engulfed the winery as other employees tried to put out the flames despite the low water pressure available. The CWA had a long-term lease here and had remodeled much of the original winery just a couple years before. It was the middle of September and fermenting wine filled the buildings. The bursting wine casks were said to have wine flowing like rivers through the facility. The main buildings were lost. Only the engine room and distillery survived. The Eggers Winery was also destroyed months later due to electrical issues encountered in a storm. It was almost as old as the Eisen Winery and the headquarters of the CWA in the Fresno area. It was fully insured. Rumors circulated that with the death of Frederick Jacobi, the CWA would completely absorb the firm into its ranks. In actuality, the Italian-Swiss colony would be the one taken over first. The CWA had purchased half the shares in 1900 after the wine wars and in 1913 took full control, acquiring the other 50% after Pietro Rossi's death. Pietro's sons Edmund and Robert would stay on, concentrating on the winemaking side at first. The Golden State champagne they produced had become a huge hit. New champagne cellars were constructed, and due to their changing needs, 300,000 gallons of cooperage and 4 wine tanks, along with train cars, each able to hold 12,000 gallons, were shipped to Winehaven, where cooperage was in high demand. Kittredge was always a little quieter than Morgan. There weren't as many articles in the papers. He's maybe a bit more heads down, businesslike. Had this to say in 1913 when asked about plans for the association. Quote, "Our purpose is to establish a standard and profitable price for growers so that the grape-growing industry of California will invite capital and intelligence. We have the world for a market, and California wines are in increasing demand. That the so-called merger contemplates squeezing the grower or the consumer. Why should we make growing unprofitable or prices too high for the consumer? We tend to exert ourselves to aid the grower and promote the sale of California wines. There is profit in our investment in doing so, and the grab-all game is not a safe one to follow where such great capital is invested." Unquote. 1913 did see some price increases. The Italian-Swiss colony was paying $25 a ton for grapes. They purchased nearly the entire crop in the Sebastopol area. The vintage turned out well with regards to quality. A slower vintage allowed the grapes to be picked more leisurely. In other areas like Gilroy of southern Santa Clara Valley, the CWA let growers out of their contracts for the year. So instead of taking the $14 to $16 a ton from the CWA, they were able to get up to $21 a ton from local wineries. In late October, with federal wine taxes about to rise, orders came pouring in. The CWA shipped over 1,000 barrels from Winehaven to New York. As the brandy tax came into play, 55 cents per gallon by now, the wine and raisin men both tried to figure out what to do. The raisin men because they grew so much of what was distilled into fortifying brandy. Muscats and second crop for fortifying spirits amounted to close to $1.5 million a year for raisin makers. It was suggested to perhaps fortify with half the brandy once the wine was close to dry, and then back sweeten later with condensed juice, or to perhaps stop the fermentation leaving residual sugar. They could distill the brandy but place it in bond for when the tax was gone also. It was implied that this higher tax would be for only maybe 2 years or so. They were surprised and horrified when they heard it would be repealed and replaced with a $1.10 tax instead. The CWA instantly notified all that they would be cutting back on grapes and only purchasing from their usual affiliated growers. They were making a ton of wines right now, as you might imagine. Here's a lineup of the Calwa wines and brandies at the time. Winehaven, a fully matured claret. La Loma, fine Burgundy. Hillcrest, finest old Cabernet Claret. Greystone, good light Hock. Rockdale, Chablis. Cerrito, fine dry Sauternes. Glenridge, fine Haute Sauternes. Vinecliff, finest Riesling. Watoki, good old sherry. Madrona, fine old port. Dulzura, finest old Tokay. Calheta, Malaga. And Angelica, San Martino, Madeira. Ruby Cliff, sparkling Burgundy. Goldcliff, sec, sparkling Mosel. Goldcliff Brut, dry Champagne. They also had wines under each of the firms: C. Carpi & Co. Wines, B. Dreyfus & Co. Wines and Brandies, Kohler and Frohling Wines and Brandies, Kohler and Van Bergen Wines and Brandies, S. Lackman & Co. Wines, Napa Valley Wine Co. Wines, as well as the newer firms they controlled: the Italian Swiss Colony, C. Schilling, George West, Lackman and Jacobi, etc. More styles of brandy were also made, from peach, pear, prune, and apricot. There was Mendota made from Folie Blanche in a cognac style, and other brandies named Yosemite, Rochelle, Fortuna, and Greystone that were all made from grapes as well, along with the pure red and white Calwood juice we talked about earlier. As the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition came to town, it gave the newly rebuilt San Francisco a chance to show off. The CWA did its part by providing boat rides into the bay for some to view their new winery at Winehaven, and the skyline of San Francisco across the bay from each other. Awards issued to the CWA wines here included a grand prize for its Greystone, which was mostly Napa Cabernet, and that Cerrito that we just spoke about, the dry Sauterne. Medals of honor were given to the Dulzura, the Rockdale, and that Vinecliff Riesling. Some gold medals included their Angelica, their Winehaven Claret, the La Loma Burgundy, the Calheta Malaga style wine, Cabernet Claret, the Watoki Port, and the Watoki Sherry. Now this sounds like a lot, and it is. Other wine firms did well also. It's just that most of them were owned or controlled by the CWA. I counted nearly another 20 medals of honor and 30 golds from wineries that were owned or controlled by the CWA. Henry Lackman, the greatest taster the CWA had known, passed away soon after the fair, having helped the CWA obtain its prominent position in the industry. William Hansen had also died suddenly only a few months before. He had served the CWA for 20 years and worked with Percy Morgan in Denver and San Francisco before the start of the CWA. To add to the sadness, he retired at the beginning of November and was dead only 8 days later. It won't be our last unfortunate CWA death. A brighter spot was the much-delayed opening of the Panama Canal, which cut ocean freight prices by a quarter, saving a large amount on wine headed to the East Coast. This coincided roughly with the outbreak of World War I, which sharply cut French wine exports. Over the next couple years, orders from other countries would expand. Larger orders from the Philippines, Mexico, China, and Japan would come in as the European export slowed to nearly nothing. Every year seems like an adventure for the CWA during this time, and again in 1915, some growers in the sweet wine areas, especially Fresno, chose to dry their grapes, turning them into raisins instead of wine. A clause in the contracts allowed the CWA the option to cancel if any legislation that was found unfavorable to the CWA was enacted. This time, like always, that legislation was taxes on brandy. The association's offer to growers was to do the crushing and winemaking, allowing the growers 120 gallons of wine to the ton, which presumably would then be sold back to the CWA. This was kind of the CWA standby move in case you haven't noticed it happening a few times previously. Consolidation continued. Redundant jobs in the many different companies the CWA controlled were eliminated. For others, salaries were cut. Louis Wetmore, who by now was general manager of the CWA, informed everyone that no improvements to facilities would be made this year. One thing the CWA was always doing was improving facilities. Winehaven had been enlarged nearly every year since it opened up to this point. There are other large wineries too, so saying no to improvements for a year was a big deal. This was also the year that the CWA finally threw back the veil, allowing the public to see for the first time that all the different brands and competitors were just illusions and they were in fact controlled by the CWA. I'll let Sidney Block tell you more about that.
I was in my office. My father had passed on, and I was representing Lockman Jacoby. And the government man walked in, and he said to me, "You Mr. Block?" And I said, "Yes." And he showed me his credentials. And he said to me, "I want all the letters that are in your possession that were written to your father and to you by Lockman and Jacoby and so forth and so on." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. You'll have to see the district attorney." And I said, "Well, let me get in touch with my lawyer." He said, "No, this is supposed to be incommunicado, see?" So I said, "Well, what have I done?" He said, "I don't know." So I went over to the district attorney's office, and they asked me some questions. "Why is it that you have the same price as your competitors on such and such a day?" I said I couldn't answer, which was true. And finally, they paid me $1.50 for being a witness against my own firm. See, which made it very embarrassing. So I rang Mr. Moore out here, and I said, "Mr. Moore, I got $1.50 in my pocket. I'm scared to cash the check." Yeah, so he said, "Sid, what's trouble?" And I told him. And he said, "Well, sit down, don't worry about it." So I said, "Well, I am worried about it. They got all my letters. They got my father's letters, copies of my letters over in the district attorney's office." Well, it wasn't long after that when, frankly, the barrels were all marked capital stock owned by California Wine Association, Lockman Jacoby brand, C. Schilling and Company brand, Italian Swiss Colony brand, and it was all clarified. And I don't mind telling you, I felt very good. Yeah. And we continued right from there. And then I represented Lockman and Jacoby until the time of Prohibition.
Prohibition would be a bigger battle, and one the CWA would never win. Taxes on fortifying brandy were being raised exponentially starting in 1915. The drumbeat of a total prohibition was growing louder. The fight had been going on since before the CWA even started. They tried to fight back. Wine had always been the safe drink compared to demon rum, and the CWA thought temperance versus prohibition advertising and booklets were the way to win. Andrea Barbaro of the Italian Swiss Colony was at the forefront of the temperance movement, writing and distributing booklets and pamphlets and lobbying Congress. The so-called Sabarbaro doctrine of wine would lead to temperance, not whiskey, rum, or other spirits. They would distribute other pamphlets like How Prohibition Would Affect California by the California Grape Protective Association, or often print their own, which might include quotes on wine's health benefits from both contemporary and ancient sources. There were some prohibition victories along the way, like when a set of measures was defeated by California voters. But this was going to be a national matter, and by 1917, they'd given up the, quote, prohibition warfare. As prohibition continued its approach, Edmund and Robert Rossi would purchase the Italian Swiss Colony's Asti vineyard for $240,000. They were confident repeal would happen and held over 200,000 gallons of wine in reserve for that day. In the meantime, they could ship fruit and juice to the east, maybe make some sacramental or medicinal wine. The good times for Winehaven wouldn't last long. With oncoming prohibition, its production would decrease. Management of the CWA would face criticism for the secrecy of their plans leading up to Prohibition. Secrecy had been built into their DNA since the beginning. The Distillers Security Corporation, commonly known as the Whiskey Trust, were already preparing their plans for food manufacture. They had gone so far as to change their name to the United States Food Products Corporation. The CWA was making changes, but they were mostly in secret, and stockholders were worried. Kitteridge gave way to Mark Fontana as president of the CWA. Fontana, with his experience running the Italian Swiss colony, was a natural to step into the role. He had held a large amount of stock in the CWA for 10 years, and he was an early supporter of Sabarbaro going back to the founding of the agricultural colony. The California Wine Association would begin liquidating assets in 1918, selling off whatever inventory they could. They would also dispose of some of their 52 wineries. Even so, they still owned over 60 pieces of real estate. In 1917, as they prepared for liquidation, a 53-page document listing all their properties was made with acreage, potential future uses, and more. For 1919, growers received an average of $30 to $55 a ton for grapes. Some got up to $85 a ton, so a big rise from the low 20s per ton just a couple years previous. The highest amount we've seen, in fact. Production of Calwa juices eventually hit 12 million gallons around this time. Sometimes 5,000 cases at a time were shipped to New York. Grape syrup and wine vinegar were also tried in an effort to diversify. Of course, sacramental wine was also attempted. 1919 would be the last vintage the CWA would ferment. On April 16, 1920, Morgan committed suicide in the mansion of his 150-acre estate near Los Altos. He had been depressed due to poor health from an automobile accident several months earlier. The experts at Johns Hopkins had determined that no more could be done to repair his broken collarbone. The coming prohibition couldn't have been easy on the man either. His wife and household staff had been keeping a close eye on him, fearing this could be coming. But early in the morning, he went to a private library room, far removed from the daily activity of the house, and shot himself in the chest with his shotgun. His funeral was a private family and friends-only affair. At the time of his death, he was still involved with the Fruit Canners Association, Union Trust Company, Natomas Consolidated of California, General Petroleum, and Stanford University, where he was a trustee. His friend and business associate I.W. Hellman had passed away only a week earlier. At its height, the CWA controlled about the same percentage of wine sales that the largest 7 currently control. It's also about the amount of United States wine production that comes from California. They had 64 different wineries at this peak. There are even more they purchased from. Thanks for listening today. We really hit some peaks and valleys in this episode. I know it was a long one. What strikes me most here is just how year to year they took the industry. Every year was its own fight. Prices high, prices low, weather, wars, tariffs, all having such a huge effect. The CWA isn't quite done with, but they will be much different going forward. We have 2 episodes in the series left. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like travel, research book purchases, things like that. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with part 6. Have a good one.